Class, this is Blair. I'm here for week 11 discussion post. To start us out, describe two ways you see the in-person and online classes are continuing to integrate regarding child and adolescence. The first thing that I thought about was really thinking about with our time at CDC, the um, play that Rebecca talked about on a spectrum of, or a continuum of directive versus non-directive. Um, and being in the CDC, I was able to kind of see a little bit where that comes into play, as well as kind of suss out what Landreth's skills were and how to do them. Um, I also was at first really intimidated by the process of working with little kids, and still very much am, but it gave me a really good time to practice. I think that Kristen talked about in the YouTube videos, but also in class we talked about that play can feel boring, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're not going to judge that in the same way we would with adults. And to not feel discouraged. One of my favorite handouts from class so far is this one. And it says, "Do not be discouraged with these types of statements. I'm bored. I'm not a baby. This stuff seems babyish. This is dumb." And so instead, utilizing skills of reflective listening, maybe saying something like, "Counseling is not what you expected," or "What would you like to do instead?" and really empowering the kids with choice. Yeah, I think the second thing, which I kind of probably just named more than that, but is don't problem solve. I think with kids, especially when I'm nervous, my tendency is to want to problem solve. And that's also from this handout called How to Counsel Kids from Rebecca Colts. And yeah, I chose to talk a little bit about that because I wanted to integrate what we're discussing with from Landreth's, a lot of his readings and skills, and then kind of how we're utilizing them in class. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with that. I also think the role plays with suicidality and calling, practicing calling either parents or child protective services has been so helpful to reduce and minimize the fear around that for myself. Okay, question number 2. Choose one of the disorders you read about and describe 2 factors that stood out. So I chose trauma. All of this last week's readings were really interesting, but the things that I was really paying attention to with trauma is the etiology or biological impact of trauma. I was just fascinated that trauma can impact the neuroendocrine system, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system, cortisol, and reduce the effectiveness of the hippocampus, thyroid and oxytocin, which has to do with empathy and attachment and how we develop that later on in life or as we're developing. And then non-epinephrine, I think I'm saying that right, which has to do with arousal and fear, and then our serotonin levels. Just the biological impact of trauma was really surprising. I think each disorder we've looked at does certainly have a biological component, but looking at trauma and seeing how much of the body it really impacts was really devastating to see. And that also children can make a full recovery from it, but the earlier and in their development and the length of exposure may have more of a long-term impact and could impact that recovery statistic. I was really fascinated. So this is all from Shatkin 2005. I was fascinated to see the trauma systems therapy. That was briefly talked about at the end, but I would be really interested to learn more about that because I have not heard of that style of treatment. Okay, so the second thing is that I found really interesting was that I kind of already said it, but that 50% can have a full recovery, and that 80% of trauma cases are more likely for comorbidity of other disorders like anxiety and depression, ADHD, and others as well. Kind of depends on where they're at in the developmental stage of their life. The second part of this question is to think about clinical assessment and what questions you'd want to focus on. So I think part of this is, or part of assessment would be to make sure that the child is not going to re-traumatize the child to talk about it. So being really careful with that. The book talked about the importance of establishing a rapport, so that the child can feel comfortable to talk about their history, but also not prod. So yeah, I think trying to gather the history from the adults in the child's life, paying attention to functioning, coping skills, and then really asking open-ended questions to create that place of safety, and maybe have the child describe a different event in their life, and that way it can just get them talking, and then potentially they'll potentially move into that trauma side. And other factors that can help you pay attention to it is if the child is constantly re-experiencing the trauma, and that'll show up in some of the play that they're doing over and over again, and that they'll want to avoid anything related to their trauma, and it'll produce negative thoughts, moods, and they'll usually be unable to enjoy different aspects, so they might not be enjoying their play. You'll find that they may demonstrate irritability, anger, high risk destruction, behavior, and attention impairment. And usually there'll be about at least 1 month or more of symptoms. So yeah, really, really interesting. And I think utilizing really similar styles of questioning and ways of being that we talked about when trying to gather more information about a potential abuse case, similar with trauma. So choose 2 of the videos from last week and describe how they answered the questions. What to do when the child say "I love you." I know you said it definitely depends, which of course, and that you weren't going to give us an answer. But I'm just even glad to think about what I would do in that situation, and I don't have a lot of clarity on that at the moment, and will seek supervision. I wrote, about that idea. So just let that explain my thoughts on that. Also, expect the unexpected and that plans don't work. That was really helpful to think about. We've been talking about that a little bit in class as well, but I think that's an easy thing to remember so that I can prepare myself for basically not being prepared. Yeah, so those videos cracked me up because, Kristen, you're really funny, and it was nice to meet your friend, and kind of hear and see some different role plays with kids and how that might look. I don't feel like I still need any of my questions clarified at this time, but thank you for providing a space. Describe your understanding of acculturation, and I added a Z, acculturation. There we go. Process of change. It basically is a process of change that occurs when an individual from a minority culture adopts a majority culture, and that can include like general behavior and communication patterns, and ways of being. This might look like in future counseling context. I was kind of just thinking about my life in Anchorage, actually, and how with a lot of the kids that I was working with this storytelling organization, there would be a lot of kids moving in from the Alaska bush to move into Anchorage for school or just for their parents' jobs, and how to be sensitive around their transition and see where they were at. Some kids really loved Anchorage and wanted to be there and couldn't wait to get out of the villages. Others didn't have that sense, so really gathering um, a sense for the person and where they're at with being in a new culture and what it's like for them, so that you can start to really develop a lens for their story and pay attention to how it impacts them now and how they feel about it. I thought the 5 stages of, I think it was the 5 stages of acculturation, were conformity, dissonance, resistance slash immersion, introspection, and integrative awareness, and that like very much viewing it as a process for how to gauge where people are at, and that knowing that this process does occur is really helpful, and that some may not want to join the majority culture, and that that's totally okay, and how that's impacting each person's life. Another 2 important concepts to consider when interviewing a culturally or linguistically diverse counselee. One was if you need an interpreter, kind of that handout for figuring out what the specifications are for the interpreter was really important, and seeing how specific and thoughtful you want to be around that as well. Because there's going to be someone else in between you and the client, and you want to establish that trust and rapport and make sure that they have the right set of skills and the right sets of background in order to take care of that. Sorry, I got distracted. The right background in order to really convey what the client is conveying. And also that general behavior and communication patterns may be different, and that culturally those behaviors and communication patterns may be looked at differently. For instance, one example from the reading, McConaughey 2013, was that I was about to explain an example of the how some cultures have general patterns of behavior and communication differences. So, for instance, in some cultures, it may be appropriate that children are quiet and don't really speak up very much or state how they feel. And so, really paying attention to some of those behavioral expectations and differences as they may show up in counseling. Okay, number 5, what are your initial reactions to talking with an adolescent about sex, substance abuse, and suicide? How did Chapter 4 help you in learning how to address these issues in clinical assessment? I'm still very overwhelmed by all of those aspects. I thought that the case of Kelsey was really extreme, but who knows? It might not actually be. But paying attention to the underlying messages and how like each one is integrating or not integrating into a similar message that the client or counselee may be experiencing. So what are the reasons behind these behaviors? I think we're learning a lot about that with both adolescents and children, that like the behaviors themselves are usually a demonstration of some other area in their life that is not being met, or that there's that needs attention. And so, yeah, paying attention to that and being sensitive and helping figure out creative ways to make sure that the children are being safe with how they engage with those things. It's hard because you want to establish a sense of trust, and that might take time. And with certain things like this case with the unprotected sex and the potential for sexually transmitted diseases was a really big issue, and kind of maybe even using that diagnostic tree almost to help what is the most at-risk problem to address first, and then kind of going from there. But ideally looking at the whole, what's underneath all of those behavioral aspects. And number 6, as you reviewed all the handouts, what questions or learnings stood out to you in being the most helpful in your work? I think in the McConaughey, Huey, I don't know how to say that, I'm sorry, 2013, the developmental considerations and just the cultural considerations are really helpful. With developmental, limiting questions to 3 to 5 words, more than the child's usual sentence, really stood out. Because that seemed like a good parameter for figuring out how to engage the client without them not being able to understand you. And then the constant reminder of open-ended questions is also really helpful. Other than that, looking at the treatment plan from, I'm going to just pull it up here, Hungsma. Oh man. That resource seems really helpful, and I will look forward to maybe purchasing that in the future. Other than that, I think I've answered all the questions this week, and I'll look forward to seeing what everyone else has said and talking to you guys soon. Okay, bye-bye.